A simple woman with a mysterious past takes a job at a prestigious music conservatory just to hide in peace. But when the star student collapses minutes before $1 million performance, they have no choice but to force her to play an impossible piece. What happens next shocks the entire institution and exposes a truth they were never ready to hear. Stay with me. This is a story about hidden genius, prejudice, and redemption you need to hear. And before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you believe in second chances, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness might just change the way you see people forever. It all began on just an ordinary Tuesday morning. The marble floors of the Robertson Conservatory echoed with the rhythm of privileged heels clicking, voices clipped with authority, violins slicing the air with perfect precision. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting a multicolored glow over rows of practice rooms, where the gifted children of donors and dignitaries prepared to conquer the musical world. Amid this polished chaos moved a woman no one really noticed. Her name was Lillian Porter. She didn't belong here. At least, that's what everyone assumed. Lillian moved like a shadow, quiet and efficient, her blue dress modest, her chestnut braid neat. She was the new administrative assistant, 6 weeks into the run, and already an invisible part of the furniture. She carried stacks of sheet music without question, corrected spelling errors no one else caught, and made the best coffee in the building. Not one faculty member knew where she had come from. No one asked, no one cared. Miss Porter came the clipped voice of Dr. Constance Whitmore, head of piano studies. As she strode down the corridor like she owned time itself, these need to be alphabetized by composer, not chronologically. Lillian accepted the rebuke with a quiet nod. Of course, Dr. Whitmore, I'll fix it right away. Whitmore didn't look up from her leather-bound planner, merely handed over the stack with perfumed indifference. Her heels clicked away. Sharp as a metronome, Lillian watched her go, and for a moment, just the faintest flicker of something crossed her face. Not hurt, not anger, something far more ancient, recognition. She looked down at the sheet on top of the pile, a Liszt transcription of Beethoven's Fifth. Her fingers twitched, almost involuntarily. The movement was so slight it would have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But to Lillian, it was as if her muscles remembered a language they hadn't spoken in years. She had once lived through every note on this page. Her hand hovered just a moment longer before she pulled herself away, daydreaming on the job. Miss Porter, the voice was dry and lightly mocking. Professor Walter Thornton, senior composition faculty, an unofficial conservatory relic. His wire-rimmed glasses rested on the edge of his nose like they were trying to escape his face. Lillian straightened, just organizing. Professor, he tilted his head, peering over her shoulder at the score. For someone with no musical training, you sure know how to arrange pieces by difficulty. I've picked up a few things over the last 6 weeks, she said simply. He sniffed, unimpressed. Understanding music isn't about filing paper. It's about lineage, discipline, breeding. He drew out the last word like a verdict. I wouldn't presume otherwise, she said, keeping her eyes low. He walked off muttering, as if the decline of the conservatory began and ended with her existence. Lillian didn't flinch. She returned to her task, fingers brushing the corners of the pages like they were old letters from another life. There was a reason she chose this job, a reason she kept her voice soft, her footsteps quieter still, a reason she never touched a piano when the room was empty. Though every night after the halls fell silent, her hands would tremble with unspent sound. She wasn't hiding from people, she was hiding from herself. But the universe has a funny way of calling us back to who we are, even when we're doing everything we can to disappear. So let me ask you, have you ever underestimated someone only to find out they were extraordinary? Or have you ever been the one the world overlooked? Tell me where you're watching from, and let's keep going, because you're not going to believe what happens next. The conservatory's main hall glimmered like a cathedral. Polished floors, golden sconces, and an imposing portrait of its founder watched silently over the students rushing through its corridors. Lillian walked through this world like a ghost, invisible but indispensable. That morning, she was assigned to prepare the recital room for the upcoming Danson Foundation Scholarship Competition, a prestigious event that determined which elite student would receive not just funding, but validation. It was, for the young musicians of Robertson, nothing short of a reckoning. As Lillian unlocked the doors to the recital hall, the empty seats stared back like expectant eyes. She moved between the aisles methodically, placing programs on each chair, aligning them with surgical precision. The air was heavy with anticipation. Even in the silence, her fingers trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from something else entirely. Memory. 5 years. 5 years without the stage. 5 years without applause. 5 years without risk. Her last performance had ended in disaster. A trembling hand, a missed note. The critics had torn her apart like wolves scenting weakness. They'd written about her fall with poetic relish. The tragedy of talent undone by fragility. Lillian Kurtz, the ghost of her former brilliance. After the Vienna recital, she disappeared. She hadn't touched a stage since. That's what made this place so appealing. No one here looked too closely. They assumed too easily. A quiet woman with no resume and excellent typing skills. Certainly not a threat, certainly not anyone of note, and that was exactly how Lillian had wanted it until now. A knock at the stage door broke her thoughts. Gregory Palmer stood there, a mop of tousled blonde curls and a half-panicked look in his eyes. He was carrying his sheet music like it might bite him. "Oh, hi, Miss Porter," he stammered, as if surprised she had materialized out of thin air. "Good morning. Mr. Palmer, you're here early." He gave a half shrug. Couldn't sleep. Lillian gestured for him to enter, and he made his way to the grand piano in the center of the room. He placed his score down and hovered beside the bench without sitting. "You'll be performing the least transcription tomorrow," she asked gently. He nodded, then exhaled. "I'm trying. It's insane. Madame Dubois says I'm the only student with the chops for it." "You are," Lillian said with calm certainty. Gregory looked at her, surprised. "You think so? I've heard you practice." He laughed nervously. "Yeah, but your staff. I mean, no offense, you're not really in the music side of things." Lillian's eyes softened, but she said nothing. Instead, she walked closer to the piano, eyeing the sheet music. "You're pushing too hard in the allegro," she said, pointing to a passage. Liszt wanted to capture Beethoven's thunder, but with control. The dynamics are less about volume and more about clarity. Less hammer, more blade. Gregory's mouth opened slightly. "That's exactly what Madame said, but the way you say it makes more sense." She stepped back, catching herself. "I just overheard some lessons. That's all," she offered, her tone neutral again. Gregory looked at her with the tentative reverence of a boy trying to place where he's seen a face before. "I didn't know you played." "I don't," she said reflexively. "Then, not anymore." Before he could ask further, the hall door opened and Dr. Whitmore entered, her presence slicing the room in two. She paused when she saw Lillian beside the piano. "Miss Porter," she said flatly, "this is not your domain. Please return to your duties." Gregory stepped aside quickly, embarrassed. Lillian merely nodded and retreated, disappearing into the side hallway like smoke curling under a door. Later that afternoon, she was summoned to Madame Dubois's office again. This time, the French coach was not alone. Dr. Whitmore and Professor Thornton were both seated, locked in what looked like a very quiet argument. "Ah, Miss Porter," Madame Dubois said without looking up. "You are here. Good." Lillian paused in the doorway. The air was different charged, suspicious. She felt it before anyone spoke. "We've been reviewing the program logistics for tomorrow's competition," Whitmore said, steepling her fingers, "and we've noted several irregularities." Lillian furrowed her brow, unsure if this was an accusation or simply one of the professor's passive-aggressive rituals. "What kind of irregularities?" "You made annotations on the printout of the Liszt transcription program notes," Thornton interjected, gesturing toward a paper on the desk. "Handwritten notes, in pencil, identifying phrasing suggestions. I was only making corrections to formatting." Lillian said, keeping her tone neutral. Whitmore leaned forward. You used a treble clef symbol to indicate phrasing between measures 112 and 118. That's not a formatting correction. Lillian's silence was damning. I found it helpful. Madame Dubois said softly, surprising everyone. It clarified a passage that had long been debated. I assumed you had consulted someone. Lillian's heart began to pound. I apologize. It won't happen again, she said. But something had changed in the room. Not just suspicion now, curiosity. As she turned to go, Thornton asked suddenly, where did you study? Miss Porter, she paused, then turned back slowly. I didn't. She lied. Not formally. Thornton frowned, but didn't push. Whitmore scribbled something in her planner, already dismissing the moment. It was the kind of question that would come back that evening. Alone in the press room, Lillian watched the final batch of competition programs emerge from the printer. The rhythmic hum of the machine was oddly soothing. She reached for one of the freshly printed sheets and read the list of competitors. Each name carried the weight of expectation, of lineage, of entitlement. None of them had bled for the music. None of them had come back from silence. She slid her fingers down the page until she found Gregory Palmer's name. Beside it, in italicized gold print, were the words Franz Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Symphony, 5 in C, minor, and below that, in fine font duration, 14 minutes. Notorious for technical difficulty, she didn't notice the tears until one dropped on the paper, blurring a line of text. She wiped it quickly and pressed the sheet under others to dry. The page felt heavier than it should have, the weight of what she once was, the weight of what she could still be. That night, in her small apartment just outside campus, Lillian sat at her upright piano for the first time in months. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then softly, reverently, she began to play the opening motif of Beethoven's Fifth. Not with force, not with fire, but with memory. It came back like a whisper at first, then a flood. The chords, the crescendos, the staccato fire of Liszt's imagination. Her hands remembered, not every detail, not every nuance, but the shape of the storm, the contour of the fury. She stopped after 7 minutes, not because she couldn't go further, but because she was shaking, not from fear, from something deeper, anticipation, and far away. In the darkened corridors of the Robertson Conservatory, fate stirred like the overture to a forgotten symphony, one that was never meant to be played again. Until now, morning at the Robertson Conservatory began with the usual rhythm of ambition, the rustle of sheet music, the low hum of scales bleeding through practice room doors, and the clipped voices of professors sharpening their critiques like scalpels. But on the morning of the scholarship competition, that rhythm trembled with urgency, the kind that tingled beneath the skin. Lillian could feel it the moment she stepped through the back entrance. The main atrium had been transformed overnight. Velvet ropes guided guests toward their seats. Floral arrangements the size of toddlers stood like sentinels along the stage. Donors, many of them draped in silk and old money, drifted through the foyer with flutes of champagne and curated smiles. The air smelled of polish and tension. Lillian moved through it all unnoticed. As always, she carried the final program leaflets, her steps precise, her presence muted. No one noticed her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the papers on the welcome table. No one saw her eyes flick to the stage door every few minutes. She was waiting for something unnamed, but inevitable. Miss Porter. Thank heaven. Professor Thornton called out suddenly, materializing beside the refreshment table. His bow tie had already begun its inevitable slide askew. You have the seating chart, yes, sir, Lillian replied, producing a printed map from her leather folder. Excellent, he said, barely glancing. Please ensure the judge's water is replenished throughout. And for God's sake, stay invisible. These people paid to see music, not logistics. Lillian nodded and turned, suppressing the sharp reply that nearly rose. Not because his words hurt, they didn't anymore, but because she didn't want to waste breath explaining herself to a man who had already decided she wasn't worth listening to. Backstage was a different world, chaotic, nervous, raw. Young performers paced in narrow hallways, muttering pieces under their breath, some gripping talismans like rosary beads, others silently weeping behind dressing room doors. The air was thick with rosin dust and fear. Gregory Palmer sat in the far corner, fingers drumming his knees, head tilted back against the wall. His eyes were closed, but his lips moved, whispering silent rehearsals. Lillian stood nearby, organizing refreshments on a silver tray. She kept one eye on him. He was too still. When the stage manager called out a 10-minute warning, Gregory opened his eyes and looked straight at her. "I can't do it," he whispered. Lillian paused. "You can." He shook his head. "No, my fingers feel wrong. My hands tight. I couldn't even finish the allegro this morning." She set the tray down and knelt beside him. "Let me see." He hesitated, then extended his right hand. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. "You're not injured," she said quietly. "You're terrified. I've performed before. Not like this. Not with half the board of the Danson Foundation breathing down your neck." Gregory looked away. "I'm going to ruin it." "No," she said gently. "You're just not ready. There's a difference." He blinked at her, confused by the kindness in her voice, as if he'd never heard compassion in that hallway before. "I don't understand," he said. "You're just an assistant. How do you know what this feels like?" Lillian looked at him for a long moment. Then her eyes flicked toward the stage entrance, where Dr. Whitmore and Madame Dubois were in quiet, sharp discussion. "I know more than you think," she said, before Gregory could press. The hallway filled with sudden noise. Dr. Whitmore strode toward them, her expression tight. "Mr. Palmer, you're opening the program. Take your place in the wings." Gregory stood unsteadily. Lillian rose as well, but kept her gaze averted. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Porter, please remain here and monitor the green room. We can't have distractions." As they left, Lillian lingered at the edge of the hallway, just within earshot. She watched Gregory square his shoulders, take a deep breath, and disappear behind the stage curtain. A moment later, applause signaled the beginning of his introduction. She closed her eyes. From the speakers mounted backstage, she heard Dr. Whitmore's voice echo across the recital hall, her practiced cadence laying out the importance of the day, the legacy of the Robertson Conservatory, the promise of future greatness in the hands of its students. And then, the name Gregory Palmer. The piano's first notes came soft, hesitant. Gregory was holding back. By the third measure, it was clear his technique was there, but the soul was not. He had taken Lillian's advice about the allegro too literally. It was clean, but hollow. There was no thunder, no storm. Lillian winced. The applause at the end was polite, almost obligatory. No murmurs of awe, no shifting in seats, just the sound of clapping hands doing what decorum required. She turned as Madame Dubois slipped quietly into the green room during the intermission, her face drawn. "How did he do?" she asked Lillian. Though she already knew, he played correctly. Lillian said carefully, but not completely. Dubois sighed. "He is still a bore. He plays the piano. He does not yet speak through it." She approached the refreshments, selecting a glass of water. "Miss Porter, take this to the judge's table." Quietly, as Lillian crossed into the wing, tray in hand, she passed behind the thick velvet curtains and into the auditorium's side aisle. The performance had paused for a short intermission. Faculty and donors milled about in soft conversation, and the judges sat in a reserved section near the stage, sipping tea. She moved like smoke, silent and unobtrusive, placing the glasses on their table, but then she paused. Dr. Whitmore's voice, though hushed, carried. "Palmer was a disappointment," she said flatly, "too controlled. His crescendos were mechanical. I've told Dubois." Professor Thornton responded, swirling the coffee in his cup. "Her romanticism is outdated. These students need structure, not sentiment. Otherwise, they'll fall apart." Lillian's hand froze mid-motion. Liszt was a showman, not a philosopher. Thornton continued, "You either command the room or you lose it. Palmer did neither. It was not the criticism that stung. It was the certainty in their voices, the authority of people who believed they owned truth. Ah, Thornton said, noticing her. Miss Porter, still eavesdropping. I see. Whitmore looked up, startled. What did you think of Mr. Palmer's performance? It was a trap, but something rose in Lillian, uninvited and unstoppable. I thought he was technically excellent, she said softly, but he didn't understand the piece. Whitmore blinked. Excuse me, Liszt's transcriptions aren't just technical showcases. Lillian continued, voice steady. They're reimaginings. He wasn't just translating Beethoven, he was in conversation with him. There's dialogue in that score. And Mr. Palmer played only one voice. The silence was instant, unforgiving. Dr. Whitmore's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Thornton stared as if she had grown a second head. I'm sorry, Lillian added quickly. I shouldn't have spoken. No, you shouldn't have. Whitmore snapped. Return to your post. Lillian bowed her head and slipped away. She didn't see the glance that passed between the two professors. The moment had planted something neither of them could quite name. A question. Back in the green room, Gregory sat slumped on a bench, head in his hands. Lillian approached but said nothing. He didn't look up. They didn't like it. He muttered. They didn't hate it either. Gregory looked at her, hollow-eyed. I practiced for months. I thought I was ready. But when I walked out there, it just, vanished. I couldn't feel anything. You will, she said. He looked up. How do you know? She didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. Gregory took it, unfolding it gently. A program. Vienna. 5 years ago, Lillian Kurtz. His eyes widened, then his breath caught. That's you, he whispered. You're her. Lillian said nothing, but the look in her eyes steady. Unflinching was answer enough. Gregory stared at her, his voice barely audible. Why did you stop? She took a long breath. Because once, I played for the world, she said. And when I broke, the world watched me bleed. I came here to disappear, to forget what it felt like to want again. But you still want it. Lillian met his gaze. No. She said, I want you to have it, and not be afraid of it. And somewhere, far beyond the walls of Robertson Conservatory, a wind was shifting. A storm was coming, not of fury but of reckoning. A sharp knock echoed through the backstage hallway. The final performance block of the Danson Foundation scholarship competition was just minutes away, and the air behind the stage was tighter than a drawn bow. Faculty whispered with urgency. Clipboards passed from hand to hand, and the stage manager stood frozen mid-step, one hand clutching his headset like it might anchor him through the chaos. Dr. Constance Whitmore stood at the center of it all, her perfectly ironed suit slightly creased for the first time all day. A bead of sweat just beginning to betray itself at her temple, she looked down at the folded note that had just been delivered. Her lips tightened. He can't go on, she said aloud, the words slicing through the bustle. Gregory Palmer is having a panic attack. The phrase landed like a piano drop from the rafters. What do you mean he can't go on? A Professor Thornton demanded, his glasses fogging as he blinked furiously. Whitmore turned to Madame Dubois, who had just returned from Gregory's dressing room. The older woman shook her head, her usual elegance dimmed by concern. He's sitting on the floor, breathing into his hands. He says he can't feel his fingers. God help us, Thornton muttered, pulling at the knot of his bow tie. This is a disaster. Lillian stood at the far end of the corridor, just out of their sight line, her hands resting lightly on the edge of a prop cabinet. She hadn't moved since the moment she overheard the diagnosis. Panic attack. She closed her eyes. She remembered what that felt like, not as an observer, but as a survivor. I told you this repertoire was too ambitious. Whitmore snapped. Her voice clipped. The Danson Foundation is expecting Liszt. They've flown in specifically for it. We should substitute another piece. Dubois offered, though without conviction. No time, no pianist. Everyone else has performed or plays a different instrument. Thornton countered, unless you can convince the cello section to develop 30 more fingers in the next 5 minutes. We're out of options. Whitmore ran a hand through her hair. That tiny, uncharacteristic gesture told Lillian more than any words ever could. The final performance is the capstone, Whitmore said, her voice low, as if the very walls were listening. If we cancel, we don't just lose face, we lose funding and prestige, and possibly the Foundation's future involvement. Madame Dubois glanced at the stage door. Perhaps we tell the audience there was an emergency, an illness, an excuse. Thornton grunted. A mercy, Dubois corrected. There was a moment of silence, a hanging breath. Then Lillian stepped forward. I can play. The words fell like snow, quiet, disarming, but unmistakably present. All three professors turned to look at her. Expressions ranging from irritation to confusion to something more primal disbelief. I beg your pardon, Thornton said. Already dismissive. I know the piece, Lillian said, calm and unshaken. Lists transcription, all 14 minutes. Whitmore blinked, as if trying to place her among the living again. Miss Porter, this is not a rehearsal. This is one of the most difficult works in the piano repertoire. I'm aware. Lillian said, I've performed it before. There was a pause. Thornton laughed first. It wasn't a kind laugh. You perform where at a middle school talent show, Madame Dubois didn't laugh. Her head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing with sudden, focused scrutiny. You said you had no formal training, she said softly. I said I had no degree on file. Lillian replied, no one asked about training. Whitmore's brows drew together. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Lillian said, her voice steady, that you let me save the program. There was something in her tone unapologetic, clear, sure that halted any immediate retort, not arrogance, not bravado, just certainty, and that, perhaps, was more unsettling than anything else. Absolutely not, Thornton said. This is insane. She's a secretary, not a soloist. She was Lillian Kurtz, Dubois said quietly. The silence that followed was total. Whitmore's mouth opened slightly. Excuse me, I didn't see it until now. Dubois continued, not clearly, but the phrasing, the posture, the fingers. She's not just anyone. She's the prodigy who vanished after Vienna. Lillian looked at her with something like gratitude, but also pain. Yes, she confirmed, that was me. Thornton staggered backward slightly, as if struck by an invisible hand. No, that's impossible. Whitmore stared at her, disoriented. Why? Why would you hide that? Because I needed to be invisible, Lillian said. I needed to know if I could still exist without the weight of expectation, without the noise. You've been working here, organizing sheet music, taking coffee orders. While we talked about me in the past tense, Lillian said, a flicker of emotion finally in her voice, as if I were already gone. You disappeared after the accident. Whitmore whispered, no one ever said where you went. No one thought to look. Lillian answered simply. Another silence stretched between them, this one heavier. Older. You can't expect us to believe. Thornton began, but Dubois cut him off with a raised hand. She doesn't need you to believe, Dubois said, her voice cool. She only needs a piano. Whitmore stared at Lillian, searching for a crack in the surface, a tremor, a tell, but there was none. If you go out there and fail, she said coldly, it will humiliate this institution. You'll destroy any goodwill we have with the Foundation, and you will be terminated immediately. I understand. Lillian replied, why would we trust you with this? Thornton spat. You've trusted lesser players with more. Lillian replied, not unkindly. I'm simply offering a solution. Whitmore turned toward the stage manager, who had appeared in the doorway. How much time? 3 minutes, he said, checking his watch. The audience is getting restless. Whitmore exhaled through her nose, sharp and quick. Then she looked back at Lillian. Fine, you play, but if you make a single mistake, I won't, Lillian said. Thornton shoved the sheet music toward her. the pages fanning like accusation. At least pretend to read this. Lillian took the pages, then smiled faintly. Thank you, but I won't need them. The stage manager motioned. It was time. As Lillian stepped onto the stage, a polite ripple of applause greeted her. The audience did not know her. Not yet. To them, she was just a fill-in, a name added last minute, a curiosity. She took her seat at the grand piano, the same one Gregory had practiced on just days before. She adjusted the bench with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The hall quieted. An expectant hush filled the rafters. She placed her hands on the keys, and for the first time in 5 years, Lillian Kurtz played. The first chord struck not just the air, but something deeper, something ancient in the bones of every person present. The notes were not mechanical. They did not simply fall from the keys. They leapt, soared, crashed. It was Liszt. It was Beethoven. But more than anything, it was her. The storm had returned, not to destroy, but to reclaim. And by the third measure, even Dr. Whitmore was leaning forward, breathless. The final chord hung in the air like a held breath, then broke into silence so absolute that it bordered on reverence. Lillian sat motionless at the grand piano, her fingers still grazing the keys, her chest rising and falling with the quiet rhythm of spent fire. The vast auditorium so often filled with judgment, critique, whispering evaluations was now a cathedral of awe, and for the first time in years, Lillian felt seen, not through the lens of reputation or scandal, but simply for the sounds she had summoned and the truth she had told through music. Then came the eruption. Applause burst from the walls like thunder. Chairs scraped the floor as the audience leapt to their feet. The standing ovation wasn't polite. It wasn't performative. It was primal, involuntary, an instinctive response to something too extraordinary for words. People clapped until their palms stung, until their eyes watered, until the very energy in the room felt reshaped. Lillian bowed once, her movements composed but not detached. The performer inside her, long buried, had returned not as a spectacle but as a truth-teller. When she rose again, her gaze swept across the front row and landed on Dr. Whitmore. The older woman sat frozen in her seat, her mouth slightly parted, eyes wide. She looked like a person whose entire worldview had just cracked at the foundation. Beside her, Professor Thornton was blinking rapidly, his glasses fogged from the heat of his breath. He removed them, wiped them, put them back on, only to remove them again. His expression shifted through disbelief, embarrassment, and something close to wonder. Only Madame Dubois was already standing. She hadn't clapped until the final chord had fully dissolved, but when she did, it was with slow, steady rhythm, and tears quietly shining in her eyes. Her posture was straight, but her face glowed with emotion not even she attempted to mask. She had recognized not just the music, but the soul that had returned to play it. Lillian took one final bow and walked calmly off stage. Backstage was utterly still. Even the usual frantic energy had dissipated, replaced with the stunned quiet that follows revelation. The young students who had been lounging in corners or whispering nervously now stood pressed against the walls, eyes wide. One of them, a violinist named Clara, who'd previously ignored Lillian entirely, now stared at her as if she were a myth. Only Gregory Palmer moved. He stepped forward, mouth slightly open. The panic that had consumed him earlier now completely forgotten. I've never heard he began, but couldn't finish. His voice cracked. Lillian gave him a soft smile. I told you it wasn't about force, she said gently. It's about breathing with the music, not dominating it. Gregory nodded, his throat too tight for speech. A moment later, the door burst open and Dr. Whitmore strode in, her heels clacking too loudly against the backstage floor. She looked as if she had aged 5 years in the past 10 minutes, her expression a mix of icy composure and profound discomfort. Professor Thornton followed, holding his clipboard like a shield. Miss Porter, Whitmore began, her voice taut, or should I say, Miss Kurtz. All eyes turned toward Lillian. The name rang in the air like an old spell. Lillian met her gaze without flinching. That's right, Whitmore swallowed, then turned toward the stage crew. I need a microphone. Now, the next few minutes unfolded with the strange choreography of public relations damage control. Whitmore stepped back on stage, her smile thin but polished, and addressed the audience, who were still buzzing with energy. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice echoing across the hall. Due to an unexpected medical issue, our student performer was unable to complete the final piece today. We were, however, graced by an extraordinary alternative. The audience murmured with agreement. Many were still standing. Whitmore turned toward the wings. Please welcome Miss Lillian Kurtz. Another wave of applause swelled like a second tide. Lillian stepped into the light again, her hands folded in front of her, her steps quiet but unwavering. She stood beside Whitmore, who gestured toward her as if unveiling a monument. For those unfamiliar, Whitmore continued, Miss Kurtz was once hailed as one of the most promising pianists of her generation. She has performed across Europe and America. Her interpretations of Liszt, Schumann, and Ravel considered groundbreaking. There was no script to follow beyond this point. Whitmore turned to her. Miss Kurtz, would you care to explain what brought you to our conservatory? Under a different name, Lillian breathed in, and then, without apology or theatrics, she answered, 5 years ago, I suffered an injury in a car accident. It damaged the nerves in both hands. I was told I might never play again. The murmurs grew louder now. Faces in the crowd showed a mix of recognition and memory of old articles, old headlines. A career derailed. I attempted a comeback in Vienna. I failed. Spectacularly, she let the silence stretch before continuing. I disappeared because I needed to know who I was without the music, without the applause, without the stage. I came here to be near the sound again, to see if it still lived in me. She turned slightly, addressing the audience directly now. I didn't hide because I was ashamed. I hid because I wasn't sure I belonged anymore. But today, something reminded me why I ever sat at a piano in the first place. Not for perfection, not for prestige, but to say something only music can say. The hall was silent again. This time, not from awe, but from connection. From the first row, a silver-haired man stood slowly. He wore a tailored navy suit and held a folder marked with the Danson Foundation seal. Miss Kurtz, he said, his voice smooth and commanding. My name is Robert Danson. A murmur of recognition rippled through the hall. My foundation came here today hoping to discover promising young talent. He continued, instead, we witnessed the return of a legend, but more than that, we witnessed a lesson in humility, strength, and transformation. He took a breath, then added, would you consider teaching a master class to our scholarship recipients? I believe they and all of us have much to learn from you. Before Lillian could respond, Whitmore stepped in. The Robertson Conservatory would be honored to host Miss Kurtz for a full series of masterclasses, she said smoothly. In fact, we've been discussing offering her an artist-in-residence position. Lillian arched an eyebrow but didn't comment on the obvious lie. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, I would be honored to teach, but only if the students understand that what I offer isn't perfection, it's perspective. Danson nodded. That's more than enough. As the audience applauded once again, Whitmore and Thornton retreated from the spotlight, murmuring to each other in hushed tones. Backstage, Lillian made her way down the hallway alone. She passed students who now looked at her with reverence, not dismissal. She passed practice rooms where hesitant notes had become determined ones. And when she reached the small break room, she paused. Gregory was waiting there. Will you teach me? He asked. She nodded. But only if you promise one thing. Anything. Play for yourself, not for them, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the auditorium. The world doesn't need more approval chasers. It needs artists. Gregory nodded, his eyes glistening. I want to be that. Good, Lillian said softly. Then we'll begin tomorrow. That night, as the conservatory emptied and lights dimmed, Lillian stood in the doorway of the recital hall one last time. The room was quiet now, stripped of applause, stripped of performance, but something lingered, A pulse, a whisper. She no longer needed the spotlight to define her. She had taken back her voice, and this time, she would use it to help others find theirs. Behind her, the door creaked open. Miss Kurtz came Madame Dubois's voice. Lillian. She corrected gently. Dubois smiled. You've come back. No, Lillian replied. I've just stopped running. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and history and possibility, Lillian knew this was not her return. It was her beginning. A soft rain fell over the city the next morning, washing the stone steps of the Robertson Conservatory with a gentle rhythm. The previous night's events still pulsed in the air like lingering notes. Conversations carried over breakfast tables, headlines spreading across music blogs, and whispers threading through the corridors of the institution that had unknowingly harbored one of the century's greatest living pianists. Yet inside the conservatory, beneath its vaulted ceilings and oil-painted portraits, the atmosphere had shifted. The staff greeted Lillian with cautious glances, part reverence, part hesitation, as though unsure whether to speak to her or bow. The students, meanwhile, responded with the unfiltered energy of youth-wide eyes, whispered excitement, and an unmistakable awe usually reserved for the names printed in textbooks or concert posters. But Lillian, as she walked through the hallways she had once cleaned, remained unchanged in her posture. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, not humble aware. She had not come to reclaim anything. She had come to rebuild. Her office, if it could be called that, had been hastily reassigned overnight. The brass plate on the door now read, Artist in Residence. A title that once would have meant something far grander to her now felt secondary, even humorous. The room had belonged to a retired cello professor and smelled faintly of rosin and mint tea. A grand piano, slightly out of tune, sat in the corner. Papers were stacked haphazardly on the desk. A gift basket of questionable cheeses and cheap champagne sat waiting on the chair. She ignored them. Instead, she stood before the window, watching the rain slip down the glass like liquid memory. Behind her, the door creaked. Gregory entered, carrying a folder and a pair of tired eyes. I know I'm early, he said, voice still laced with the uncertainty of someone who had grown up being told to speak only when spoken to. I didn't want to be late for our first lesson. Lillian turned, offering a small smile. You're not early. You're on time. They were just always late. He blinked, then laughed quietly. That explains a lot. She gestured to the piano. Have a seat. Gregory crossed the room, placed the folder on the bench beside him, and flexed his fingers nervously. Do you want me to warm up? Oh, Lillian said, pulling up a chair beside him. Not yet. She sat, folding her hands in her lap. Tell me why you play. Gregory hesitated. I guess because I've always been good at it. No, she said, not unkindly. That's a result, not a reason. Why do you play? He looked at her, startled by the depth of the question. Because, he paused. Because when I play, I feel like I exist in a way I don't anywhere else. It's like all the noise disappears, and there's just the sound, just the moment. Lillian nodded slowly. That's closer. He let out a shaky breath. I'm scared I'll lose that. You will, she said gently. Eventually, yes, at least once, maybe more. The silence comes for all of us, but it's not about avoiding the silence. It's about learning how to sit in it and then play anyway. Gregory said nothing, but the weight of her words settled in his chest like an anchor. Now, she said, gesturing toward the piano, play something, anything. Don't perform, just speak. He placed his hands on the keys and began softly, tentatively, a Chopin nocturne. His tempo was slightly rushed, his phrasing a touch rigid, but there was feeling beneath it like a voice trying to find the right pitch. Lillian listened without interrupting. She didn't write notes. She didn't frown. She simply closed her eyes and let the music fill the room. When he finished, she opened her eyes. You're playing like you're trying to impress a ghost, she said. Gregory blinked. What you're thinking of every pianist you've ever heard, every judge you've ever feared, every expectation hanging over your shoulder. You're not playing the piece. You're apologizing for not being someone else. He looked down, ashamed. Gregory, she said, voice softer now. You have to stop asking permission. I don't know how. He admitted. That's why you're here. She rose and moved to the piano. Her fingers touched the keys gently, and she played the same phrase he had stumbled through, but slower, warmer, more intimate. It was like hearing a familiar sentence spoken in a different language. The meaning changed. The air changed. This is what happens when you stop worrying about being impressive, she said. You become true. Over the next few days, word spread that Lillian Kurtz was not only staying but teaching. Students who had never once spoken to her now waited in line outside her door, eager to audition, to watch, even just to listen through the wall. But Lillian kept her circle small. She accepted only 5 students into her first masterclass, Gregory among them, alongside Clara from violin, a shy jazz pianist named Eli, a Korean exchange student named Hana with hands like thunder, and a brilliant but volatile prodigy named Marcus whose reputation for arrogance preceded him. Their sessions were unlike anything the conservatory had seen before. She made them play in the dark. She made them switch instruments for an hour. She made them write letters to the composers of the pieces they were practicing, imagining those composers could read them. You don't play notes, she told them. You translate thought. You retell grief. You relight joy. Thornton watched from the hallway more than once, arms folded, still unsure whether to be impressed or unnerved. Whitmore pretended not to care, but she had started requesting summaries of Lillian's lesson plans, Madame Dubois. However, simply smiled whenever Lillian passed her in the corridor, an elegant, knowing smile that said, I told you so. One evening, after the rest of the conservatory had emptied out and the halls echoed with quiet, Lillian sat alone in her new office. She was reviewing Hannah's latest assignment, a reinterpretation of Debussy's Clair de Lune as a conversation between 2 estranged lovers. The margins of the score were filled with notes that read more like poetry than instruction. She smiled. The knock at the door was hesitant. She looked up to see Dr. Whitmore standing in the doorway. May I? Lillian nodded. Whitmore entered, her posture still stiff but her voice softer than usual. I wanted to say, she began, then hesitated. You were extraordinary. Thank you. And I was wrong. Lillian tilted her head. About what? Whitmore gave a thin smile. About everything. They stood in silence for a moment before Whitmore added, would you consider giving a keynote performance for the fall gala? The donors are expecting you. Lillian thought for a long moment. I'll play, she said finally, but only if my students perform too. Whitmore blinked. They're not ready for that stage. They will be, Lillian said. That's the point. Whitmore hesitated, then nodded. Very well. She turned to leave, then paused. You know, she said over her shoulder, the real scandal isn't that we didn't know who you were. It's that we never bothered to look. Lillian said nothing, but as the door closed behind her, she allowed herself a small, private smile because she hadn't needed them to look before. But now, for her students, she would make sure the world saw, clearly, fiercely, truthfully, and that would be her greatest performance yet. The air inside the recital hall felt different than it had months ago. Back then, it was a place of pretense, of tightly wound nerves and false smiles, of performances molded to meet expectations rather than to express truth. But now, under the warm light of the chandeliers and the polished wood that gleamed like a stage ready to be reborn, the space carried a new kind of tension, not fear, anticipation. It was the night of the fall gala, and the program was unlike any the Robertson Conservatory had hosted in years. The faculty had been skeptical, the board had been cautious, but Lillian had insisted, and somehow, without force, without argument, she had gotten her way. The performers were not the top-ranked, competition-winning stars of the institution. They were the overlooked, the raw, the trembling talents still in the process of becoming. And in the center of the evening's program, placed not as a grand finale, but as a connective thread, was Lillian herself, backstage. The students huddled like a family about to step into stormlight. Clara adjusted the shoulder rest of her violin for the sixth time. Eli tapped his foot in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the jazz standard he was about to improvise. Marcus stared at his reflection in the dressing room mirror. His usual confidence softened by something unfamiliar. Humility. Gregory stood apart from the others, clutching a worn score, the edges frayed from weeks of handling. It wasn't the least piece from before. This one was Schubert, a piece Lillian had introduced him to 2 weeks earlier, during one of their late-night practice sessions when the building was asleep, and the only light came from the old desk lamp perched on the piano. She had told him, "You don't need fireworks to move up a heart. Sometimes, all you need is a single note." Played honestly. And tonight, that was all he intended to do. Lillian entered the room with the same quiet grace that had once made her invisible, now unmistakably magnetic. The students straightened without being told. She smiled at each of them in turn, not to correct or direct, but simply to see them. "You're not here to prove anything," she said softly. "You're here to share, to offer. That's all." Clara raised her hand like a schoolchild. "But what if they don't like what we offer? Then they'll miss something beautiful," Lillian said. "And that's not your fault." She looked at each of them, her voice steady. "You've earned your place on this stage not because you're perfect, but because you're honest. That's rare. That's worth hearing." The stage manager peeked in, places, 5 minutes. As the students filed out, Lillian remained behind for a moment. Her hands rested on the back of the chair, by the chair where Gregory had been sitting moments ago. She wasn't nervous. She was open. She was ready. This wasn't the return to form everyone had imagined. It wasn't about reclaiming her fame. It was about passing the flame on. She emerged into the wings just as Clara began her first notes. The audience, a mix of donors, critics, and faculty, shifted slightly at the unfamiliar name on the program, but the minute Clara's bow touched the strings, silence fell. The young violinist played not with virtuosity, but with story, every note shaped like a sentence in a language only hearts understood. Next came Eli, his fingers dancing over the piano with the controlled looseness of someone discovering something new in real time. He broke into a soft, bluesy phrase halfway through that made several older patrons sit up straighter. When he ended, there was a beat of silence before the applause, like the audience needed a moment to remember where they were. Then Gregory stepped into the light. He walked with a calm that surprised even himself. As he sat at the piano, he didn't think about the judges or the donors or even the piece. He thought of the moment in Lillian's studio when she'd played the first few bars for him. The way she'd said, "This piece doesn't ask you to be loud. It asks you to be true." And so, he was. His Schubert was quiet, almost meditative, every phrase carefully shaped, every pause deliberate. It didn't dazzle. It didn't overwhelm, but it left a hush in its wake, a kind of stillness that lingered long after the final chord faded from the wings. Lillian watched with pride swelling in her chest. When the applause came, it was softer than the standing ovation she'd once received, but to her, it meant more. It was for someone else, and that was the point. Then it was her turn. She walked on stage without announcement, without introduction. And yet, the moment she appeared, the room shifted. Everyone leaned forward. The last time she had played here, it had been an act of revelation. Tonight, it was something quieter, more generous. She chose Debussy, not because it was showy, not because it proved anything, but because it whispered. Her fingers floated over the keys, painting light and shadow across the air. She didn't play for herself. She didn't even play for the audience. She played for the students backstage, for the ones still afraid to be seen, for the ghosts of herself she had left behind. When she finished, the silence was even deeper than it had been the night of the list. This time, no one leapt to their feet. They simply sat there, held in place by something they couldn't explain. And Lillian, rather than bowing, simply stood and walked off stage, in the wings. Gregory was waiting. "You didn't bow," he said, surprised. "I didn't need to," she replied. "I already received everything I came for." He nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of mingling, clinking glasses, and careful congratulations. Faculty members who had once ignored her now approached with measured reverence. Donors gushed about the refreshing new direction of the conservatory. Even Professor Thornton shook her hand with a sheepish smile and a murmured apology. But the only conversation that mattered came later, when Lillian found herself seated beside Madame Dubois beneath the high windows of the conservatory library. The older woman sipped on tea and looked at her with a mix of warmth and curiosity. "You've changed this place," she said. "I didn't come here to change anything," Lillian replied. Dubois smiled. "That's usually how real change happens." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Dubois leaned in. "You know, if you wanted to leave again now, you could. You've done what most thought impossible." Lillian looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The stars were coming out. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly. "Not yet." "What's keeping you?" Lillian thought of the students, of their cracked voices, their questions, their courage. She thought of Gregory's face as he played, of Eli's fingers skipping like birds, of Clara's bow trembling, then steadying. "I used to think my greatest gift was playing," she said, "but maybe it's seeing." Dubois smiled. "Then stay. See us." And Lillian did. That night, as she walked home beneath the emerging stars, the weight she had carried for so long, the failure, the fear, the shame had finally lifted. In its place was something quieter, stronger, peace, not the kind that comes from applause or recognition, the kind that comes from purpose. And for the first time in a very long time, Lillian Kurtz no longer felt like she was waiting to begin again. She already had. Morning at the Robertson Conservatory arrived not with grandeur, but with the quiet rhythm of transformation. Sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, warming the polished floors where once only ambition had echoed. Now, something gentler walked those halls, purpose. The semester had turned, and with it, so had the institution. Posters of upcoming performances now included names that once would have been overlooked, students like Clara, Eli, Hannah, Marcus, and Gregory Palmer. No longer just a name whispered in the shadows of potential, but a musician with a voice all his own. The campus newsletter carried a new headline on its front page that week: "The Kurtz Effect, How One Woman Rekindled the Soul of Robertson." The article was factual, respectful, and most surprisingly written by a senior professor who had once openly questioned her qualifications. But Lillian read none of it. Her mornings were filled not with praise, but with piano. Not for an audience, not for reviews, just her and the keys. Sometimes, she'd play before sunrise, barefoot, with only the soft hum of campus life waking around her. She was composing again, tentatively, cautiously. The first bars were scattered like fragments of thought, but they came and they stayed. On a gray Tuesday, the office door creaked open mid-morning. Gregory entered without knocking, holding 2 coffees and a stack of new sheet music. He had grown more relaxed around her, not casual, but confident. There was a difference. "I brought the Schumann you asked for," he said, setting it down. "And the espresso you didn't ask for but definitely need." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Are you implying I look tired?" "I'm implying you've been here since dawn again." He grinned. She accepted the coffee and sipped. Guilty, Gregory took a seat by the window and looked out. "I still can't believe how much has changed." Lillian followed his gaze. Outside, students walked between buildings with instruments strapped across their backs. But the way they moved, the way they greeted each other, the way some even stopped mid-path to hum a phrase or try a rhythm against a wall, it was different now. The conservatory wasn't just a place of performance anymore. It had become a place of exploration. "You changed it," Gregory said quietly. "No," Lillian corrected. "You all did. I just gave permission to break the silence." He looked at her then, his expression more serious. "You're leaving, aren't you?" The question hung in the air like a chord unresolved. Lillian hesitated. She hadn't told anyone, but of course, he had noticed. He always noticed. "I've been invited to join a residency in Berlin," she said at last, "a year-long fellowship, to compose, to perform, to mentor, all without pressure, without pretense. Gregory nodded slowly. You should go. I haven't accepted yet. You should, he said again, firmer this time. You gave us what we needed. Now it's your turn. Lillian studied him. He had changed so much, not just his playing, but his presence. There was no trace of the pale, trembling boy from that first scholarship recital. He had grown not into a performer, but into a storyteller. What if I lose this, she asked, more to herself than to him. This quiet, this clarity, this peace you won't, he said, because it's yours now. You didn't borrow it from this place. You built it. A pause passed between them. Then he added, besides, we'll still need you, whether you're in Berlin or in the next room, later that week. Lillian stood before the full faculty and student body, delivering what was unexpectedly titled a farewell address. The hall was packed. Though no one had forced attendance, students sat on the steps, faculty leaned against walls, even alumni had returned, somehow drawn back by a word of something real happening within these stone walls. She didn't read from notes. I came here, she began, not to teach, not even to heal. I came here to disappear. A ripple of quiet moved through the crowd, but I was wrong about what I needed. Disappearing isn't healing. Silence isn't peace. What I needed was to be seen, not for my triumphs, not for my name, but for who I am when all of that falls away. She paused, then smiled faintly. I've found that here, not from recognition, but from students who reminded me what it means to begin again. She turned toward the rows of faces young and old, hardened and hopeful. You don't owe the world perfection. You don't owe anyone a masterpiece. All you owe is honesty. Let that be enough. It always was. When she finished, there was no ovation, no clapping, just a quiet, collective stillness. The kind of moment where everyone knows something true has just been said, and no applause could make it more meaningful. Afterward, she returned to her office one final time to collect the last of her things. The rain had started again, soft, rhythmic. She welcomed it. There was always something cleansing in the rain. As she closed the piano lid, a soft knock came. She turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, holding a small black notebook. This is for you, he said, handing it over. Lillian opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, fragments, sketches, pages from each of her students, a collective diary of their time with her. One page caught her eye, Gregory's handwriting. You taught us how to play, then you taught us why. Now we'll keep asking how. She closed the notebook and looked at Marcus. Thank you, she said, all of you. As he turned to leave, she added, take care of the others. I will, he said, but you'll come back, right? She smiled. I never really left. That evening, as the plane took off and the city receded into a canvas of gray and gold, Lillian looked out the window not with sadness, but with a sense of gravity reorienting itself. She wasn't escaping anymore. She was continuing, and somewhere in a quiet studio across the sea, a piano waited, not for a virtuoso, but for a woman who had finally remembered that her hands were not just instruments of sound, but of story. She placed her palm gently on the window, closed her eyes, and whispered the words that had carried her through it all. I'm not what I once was. I'm more. And with that, Lillian Kurtz flew into the next movement of her life. Not as a return, not as a comeback, but as a new beginning written in every note yet to be played.